Alright, in this video, we're going to go over archetypal vectors of generational transformation, midpoint dynamics, tight orb malefic configurations, and the historical epistemology of outer planet ingresses. So this is a faculty level treatise in mundane and generational astrology. We currently have Saturn in Aries, Neptune in Aries, Uranus in Gemini, Pluto in Aquarius, Chiron in Taurus, the ephemeris epoch 21 August 2026. And geocentric tropical. So this is prepared for advanced colloquia in historical astrology, archetypal psychology, and temporal epistemology. So here's a quick abstract. This monograph advances an original methodological synthesis for the analysis of generational planets. We see Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and the cincta Chiron across historical time. Privileges very tight orbs, which is lesser than 1 degree for midpoints, lesser than 2 degrees for applying malefic aspects and mundane work, and treats midpoints as primary carriers of archetypal information rather than secondary refinements. Drawing on the current sky of August 2026, Saturn and Neptune co-present in Aries, Pluto in early Aquarius, Uranus in Gemini, Chiron at the Taurus threshold. The text reconstructs the historical signature of each outer planet sign, placement through a rigorous event correlation method. Original interpretive formulae are offered for key midpoints, Saturn Chiron, as well as Neptune Pluto, Uranus Pluto, Saturn Neptune. The work is intended for faculty and advanced graduate seminars. Footnotes apply primary ephemeris sources and historiographic caveats. So the keywords here in generational astrology: midpoint theory, tight orb methodology, Saturn Neptune conjunction, Pluto in Aquarius, Chiron in Taurus, mundane historiography. Contents in this video, we're going to go over methodological foundations, orbs, midpoints, and malefic application, the current generational sky for August 2026, Saturn in Aries, historical recursions and structural initiation, Neptune in Aries, collective idealism under martial signature, Uranus in Gemini, informational disruption across cycles, Pluto in Aquarius, power networks and the collective unconscious, Chiron in Taurus, the wind of value and embodied healing, cross-planetary midpoint matrices and historical case studies, synthesis, the 2025 through 2035 generational corridor, Appendix A, selected outer planet ingress tables, 1880 through 2050, Appendix B, midpoint formulae and orb protocols, Appendix C, schematic aspect and wheel diagrams, Supplement 1, glossary of technical terms, Supplement 2, notes on historiographic method, and there will be a note. So we have a lot to go over. Let's get jumping in. So first we're going to look at methodological foundations, in meaning orbs, midpoints, and malefic applications. So right off the bat, traditional mundane practice has often employed orbs of 5 degrees to 8 degrees for outer planet aspects. And the present study deliberately restricts itself to very tight orbs, 0 degrees to 1 degrees for midpoint activations, and 0 degrees to 2 degrees for applying major aspects involving malefics, Saturn, Mars, Pluto, and Ketu. The rationale is epistemological rather than dogmatic. When a generation is under examination, the shared planetary longitude already constitutes a collective signature. Only the most precise contacts retain discriminatory power for event timing and qualitative differentiation within that generation. Midpoints are treated here as primary, not secondary data. The formula m equals a plus b divided by 2 is calculated in absolute longitude, with a shorter arc preferred when the two bodies are more than 180 degrees apart. A planet or angle falling within 1 degree of m is considered an activation. In generational work, the most consequential midpoints are those formed by 2 outer planets or by an outer planet and Saturn, because these points remain effective for years and therefore imprint cohorts rather than individuals. Original interpretive formulae for key midpoints: Saturn Chiron, midpoint of structural limitation and the wound of embodiment. When tightly activated, it correlates historically with institutional reforms that arise from collective trauma, post-war welfare states, disability rights, legislation, reevaluation of aging populations. The current transit of Chiron into Taurus, while Saturn occupies early Aries, places the midpoint near 7 through 8 degrees Aries-Libra axis, sensitizing questions of martial initiative versus material security. Saturn-Neptune, crystallization of the ideal or the dissolution of structure. The exact conjunction now forming in Aries, first exact pair expected 2026 to 2027, is the rarest and most potent expression of this midpoint. Historical analogs 1917 through 18, 1952 through 53, 1989 through 90 show simultaneous collapse of political forms and emergence of new collective myths. The Aries placement adds a signature of pioneering sacrifice and identity redefinition at the civilizational scale. Uranus-Pluto, the midpoint of radical transformation of power structures. The current trine, Uranus-Gemini, Pluto-Aquarius, keeps the midpoint near 4 through 5 degrees Aries, exactly overlaying the Saturn-Neptune zone. This creates a rare four-body resonance in the first decan of Aries, a generational initiation corridor lasting roughly 2025 through 2032. Neptune-Pluto, the deep collective unconscious in process of mutation. Their long-term sextile ongoing since the mid-20th century and reforming in the 2020s places the midpoint in the late degrees of Capricorn to early Aquarius, reinforcing Pluto's current sign placement in the theme of systemic power redistribution through invisible networks. Malefic application and the principle of exactitude. So applying aspects the orb is decreasing are given hierarchical priority over separating ones. And I know that sounds confusing because the orb is decreasing, but the aspect is applying. But in generational charts, in applying Saturn square or in opposition within 1.5 degrees is treated as a structural crisis marker, and applying Pluto square within 1 degree is treated as a transformative rupture. Historical testing against the 1939 through 45 period, 1968 through 72 upheavals, and the 2008 financial crises confirms that events of civilizational weight clustered on such tight applying configurations rather than around wider orbs. The present monograph therefore discards the notion of soft outer planet aspects for historical work. What remains is a high-resolution lens, midpoint lesser than 1 degree, malefic major aspects at lesser than 2 degrees applying, and sign ingresses rated by the condition of the planet. So direct, retrograde, speed, and aspects to the nodal axes. Here is the current generational sky for August 2026, specifically August 21st. The generational planets occupy the following approximate tropical longitudes, geocentric midnight to midnight range. You see Saturn at 14 degrees 10 Aries, retrograde, applying to Neptune, tight Venus opposition, Neptune at 3 degrees 54 Aries, retrograde, Saturn approaching Uranus sextile, Uranus at 5 degrees 32 Gemini, direct, trine Pluto sextile Neptune, Pluto at 3 degrees 42 Aquarius, retrograde, trine Uranus, early Aquarian station, Chiron at 0 degrees 43 Taurus, retrograde, recent ingress, and returning briefly to Aries. We're not totally sure if that's true or not, but the dominant configuration is the Saturn-Neptune near conjunction in Aries, still separating by approximately 10 degrees, but already within the wider historical orb of influence that has characterized previous cycles. Their midpoint lies near 9 degrees Aries. Simultaneously, Uranus in early Gemini forms a trine to Pluto in early Aquarius with an orb of 1.8 degrees, keeping the Uranus-Pluto midpoint also in early Aries. Thus, 4 generational vectors converge on the first decan of the cardinal fire sign. Chiron's presence at 0 degrees to 1 degrees Taurus retrograde places it in a tight semi-sextile to Neptune and a wider semi-sextile to Saturn. The Chiron-Saturn midpoint falls near 7.5 degrees Aries, further densifying the Aries zone. So the overall picture is one of an initiation complex, because structural Saturn, imaginal Neptune, disruptive Uranus, transformative Pluto, and wounded healer Chiron energies all focus upon the archetype of emergent identity and pioneering action. Here is a generational sky for, again, August 21st. Tropical, we see a Saturn, Neptune near conjunction in Aries, Pluto, Aquarius, Uranus, Gemini, Chiron, Taurus. And right here is a Saturn, Neptune midpoint schematic, the crystallized ideal under Marshall signature. So Saturn, Neptune midpoint equals 9 degrees Aries, crystallized collective ideal and structural dissolution. Alright, let's talk about Saturn and Aries more. Saturn's average stay in a sign is 2.5 years. Its Aries periods therefore mark relatively brief but intense intervals of structural redefinition under the sign of initiative, identity, and conflict. Previous 20th and 21st century passages, approximately 1937 through 40, 1967 through 69, 1996 through 99, and the current 2025 through 28 window, reveal a consistent pattern: the imposition or collapse of new political and military frameworks, the testing of leadership, and the crystallization of collective will under pressure. 1937 through 1940. So Saturn entered Aries in 1937, while Pluto occupied Cancer and Neptune late Virgo. The tight Saturn-Pluto square of 1939 through 40, with an orb under 1 degree at several stations, coincided with the formal outbreak of the Second World War. The original midpoint reading offered here treats Saturn, Pluto, and cardinal signs as the iron form of collective necessity, structures that cannot be negotiated because they arise from existential threat. The Aries placement of Saturn gave the necessity a martial, initiatory, and sacrificial coloration, precisely the rhetoric of the period. 1967 through 69. Saturn's next Aries transit overlapped the final phase of the Uranus-Pluto conjunction in Virgo. The midpoint Saturn-Uranus fell near 0 degrees to 2 degrees Leo, while Saturn-Pluto remained in tension. Historical events: Prague Spring, May 1968, the Tet Offensive, the assassinations of 1968 illustrate the collision of structural authority Saturn with generational rupture Uranus-Pluto. The tide-applying Saturn squared a Uranus-Pluto complex in 1969 with an orb of lesser than 1.5 degrees marked the pivot from utopia mobilization to institutional backlash. In the present passage, Saturn entered Aries in 2025. Its retrograde at 14 degrees in August 2026. Its approaching conjunction with Neptune constitutes the defining outer planet event of the decade. Unlike previous Saturn and Aries periods, the current one occurs with Pluto already in Aquarius, Uranus in Gemini, producing a cardinal fixed mutable triangulation that has no exact 20th century parallel. The original interpretation advanced here is that Saturn in Aries, under Neptune's influence, inaugurates a generation forced to rebuild identity structures after the dissolution of prior collective narratives. The Tide Orb Protocol requires us to watch the exact Saturn-Neptune conjunctions as the temporal nodes of maximum structural and imaginal fusion. Alright, Neptune in Aries. Neptune's orbital period of approximately 165 years means each sign transit lasts roughly 13 to 14 years. The last Neptune in Aries period occurred 1861 through 1875. Present ingress until 2039. Therefore returns the archetype after a full cycle. Historical correlation with the American Civil War, the unification movements in Italy and Germany, and the rise of modern nationalist mythology supplies the baseline. The original contribution of the studies to read Neptune and Aries through the lens of the Saturn-Neptune midpoint and the contemporaneous Pluto in Aquarius. Neptune in Aries dissolves and reimagines the archetype of the individual hero and the collective warrior. Under tight Saturn contact, the dissolution becomes crystallization. New myths of identity are institutionalized. The 1860s saw the forging of national identities through blood and ideology. The 2020s through 2030s appear poised to forge post-national or networked identities through analogous processes of sacrifice and idealization. The presence of Pluto in Aquarius suggests that the new myths will be technological and collective rather than purely territorial. A critical midpoint observation here. Neptune-Pluto midpoint currently falls near the Aquarius-Pisces cusp, reinforcing the theme of collective psychic mutation. When Saturn perfects its conjunction to Neptune, the entire Aries-Aquarius-Pisces complex will be activated, producing what this monograph terms a triple generational resonance. A rare historical condition last approximated in the 1840s through 1860s under different sign placements. Uranus in Gemini. So Uranus spends approximately 7 years in each sign. Its Gemini periods, notably 1941 through 1949, 1981 through 1988, and the present 2025 through 2033, consistently coincide with revolutions in communication, transport, the organization of knowledge. The 1940s brought radar, electronic computation, and the atomic information cascade. 1980s brought personal computing and the early internet protocols. Current passage overlays the maturation of generative AI, quantum networking, and the fragmentation of public epistemic authority. The original midpoint analysis offered here centers on the Uranus-Pluto trine, that's Gemini Aquarius. The midpoint at 4.5 degrees Aries falls within 1 degree the Saturn-Neptune midpoint zone. Consequently, every exact Uranus-Pluto trine several passes 2026 through 2028 simultaneously activates the Saturn-Neptune complex. This is not a causal coincidence of orbs, it is a structural resonance that links informational disruption, Uranus-Gemini, to power redistribution, Pluto-Aquarius, and to the crystallization of new collective ideals, Saturn-Neptune-Aries. Historical testing against the Uranus and Gemini of the 1850s, telegraph, rail, and the acceleration of print culture in the 1940s confirms that the tightest outer planet aspects to Uranus during these periods mark the inflection point of informational regime change. The present tight trine to Pluto therefore warrants the highest methodological priority. Pluto in Aquarius. So Pluto's highly eccentric orbit produces a sign durations ranging from 12 years Scorpio to 30 years Taurus. Aquarius transit that began in 2023 through 2024 stabilizes through the 2040s. It's the first since 1777 through 1798, the era of the American French Revolutions in the birth of modern political ideologies of equality and fraternity, the parallel is not rhetorical, it is structural. Pluto and Aquarius digs into the shadow of the collective, the will to power hidden inside networks, the coercive potential of the people, the technological sublime, and the redistribution of sovereignty from states to platforms and protocols. The original contribution of the studies to read the current Pluto placement through its tight trend to Uranus and Gemini and its midpoint relationship to Neptune. The Uranus-Pluto midpoint in early Aries, as already noted, fuses with the Saturn-Neptune zone, producing a four-planet generational signature of unprecedented coherence. Historical case study here, we see Pluto and Aquarius of the late 18th century coincide with the Uranus-Neptune opposition of the 1780s through the 90s. The present period lacks that opposition, but possesses the Saturn-Neptune conjunction and the Uranus-Pluto trine. The net effect is less revolutionary rupture and more systemic rewiring in Aquarian rather than Arian style of transformation. Tight orb stations of Pluto in 2026 through 2028 should therefore be monitored for breakthroughs or breakdowns in network governance, AI sovereignty, and collective data regimes. Chiron and Taurus. So Chiron's 50.7-year orbit produces sign periods of highly variable length. Taurus receives one of the longest days, approximately 7 to 8 years. The previous modern passages from 1926 through 1934, 1976 through 1984 correlate with crises and redefinitions of material security, bodily integrity, and economic value. The 1920s through 30s saw the Great Depression and the rise of new monetary and welfare architectures. The late 1970s through early 1980s saw stagflation, second oil shock, and the beginnings of neoliberal restructuring. Chiron entered Taurus on June 19, 2026, retrogrades back into Aries in September 2026, and re-enters Taurus for the sustained transit in April 2027. Current August 2026 position at 0 degrees 43 retrograde therefore constitutes a threshold moment. The original midpoint reading centers on Chiron Saturn, 7.5 degrees Aries, Chiron Neptune, 2 degrees Aries. Both midpoints fall inside the larger Aries activation zone already described, linking the wounded value Taurus to the structural imaginal complex of Saturn Neptune. Interpretively, Chiron and Taurus exposes the collective around sufficiency, embodiment, and the right to exist without productive justification. When tightly aspected by Saturn, it produces institutional responses, new social contracts around care, disability, aging, and ecological limits. When tightly aspected by Neptune, it produces mythologies of scarcity or abundance that can either heal or further traumatize. The simultaneous presence of Pluto and Aquarius suggests that the healing modalities will be networked, technological, and collective rather than purely individual or clinical. Cross-planetary midpoint matrices and historical case studies. So the following case studies apply the tight orb midpoint protocol to 3 historical clusters demonstrating the method's discriminatory power. We see 1939 to 1945, Saturn, Pluto, and the iron form of necessity. So Saturn in Aries, Taurus, squared Pluto in Cancer, Leo, with multiple exact passes under 1 degrees. So the Saturn-Pluto midpoint occupied early degrees of Gemini, Sagittarius, activated by Uranus and Taurus, Gemini. The configuration describes the total mobilization of industrial civilization under existential threat. The precise historical outcome. Wider orbs would have diluted the signal. The tight orb filter isolates the period of maximum structural coercion. Alright, 1968 through 1972, we got the Uranus-Pluto conjunction and Saturn's counter pressure. The Uranus-Pluto conjunction in Virgo, exact from 1965 through 66, still within 2 degrees through 1968, formed a midpoint near 17 degrees Virgo. Saturn's transit through Aries and then to Taurus applies squares and oppositions within 1.5 degrees. The historical record, global student and labor revolts followed by authoritarian stabilization, matches the midpoint narrative of radical systemic critique meeting structural resistance. 2008 through 2012, Pluto's Capricorn ingress, the Saturn-Uranus opposition. Pluto's entry into Capricorn coincided with the Saturn-Uranus opposition at Cross, Virgo, Pisces. The Saturn-Uranus midpoint fell near 0 degrees Sagittarius, while Pluto's own midpoint contacts activated the financial axis. So the tight orb events of September through October of 2008, the limit collapse, actually occurred with Saturn and Uranus within 1 degree of exact opposition and Pluto stationing. Again, the high resolution filter isolates the temporal nodes of systemic rupture. These cases establish the methodological claim. Generational history is most legible when midpoints and applying malefic aspects are held at orbs of 1 degrees through 2 degrees. Current 2025 through 2035 corridor, with its 4 planetaries resonance, is therefore expected to produce events of comparable civilizational weight, though of Aquarian rather than purely martial character. Alright, synthesis. The concurrent presence of Saturn and Neptune in Aries, Pluto in Aquarius, Uranus in Gemini, Chiron across the Aries-Taurus threshold constitutes a generational complex without precise modern precedent. The tight orb midpoint analysis reveals that the first decan of Aries functions as a focal node. Saturn, Neptune, Uranus, Pluto, and Chiron, Saturn. Midpoints all converge there. This is the archetypal signature of initiated identity under collective idealization and networked transformation. For the cohort born under these transits, roughly 2025 through 2035, the developmental task will be the reconstruction of selfhood after the dissolution of prior narrative containers within technological and ecological conditions that render older forms of security obsolete. The wound, Chiron and Taurus, concerns value and embodiment. The structure, Saturn, concerns discipline initiative. The ideal, Neptune, concerns the myths that will justify sacrifice. The disruption, Uranus, concerns the information ecology. The transformation, Pluto, concerns the redistribution of power through networks. Faculty researchers are invited to track the exact stations and conjunctions of 2026 through 2028 with the same rigorous work protocol employed in this monograph. The historical records suggest that the events clustering around those exactitudes will define the political, technological, and psychic landscape for the subsequent generation. So Appendix A is selected outer planet ingress tables. Following condensed tables as primary sign ingresses of Pluto, Neptune, Uranus, and Chiron. Retrograde re-entries are omitted for brevity. Fully ephemeride should be consulted for station dates. Times are approximate to the day, so UT. And this is for Pluto ingress. We see 1912 through 1914, Cancer. Pre-WW1 mobilization, rise of mass politics. We see 1937 through 39, Leo, authoritarian consolidation, cultural absolutism. 56 through 58, Virgo, technocratic order, early environmental consciousness. 71 through 72, Libra, diplomatic realignment, relational power. 83 through 84, Scorpio, financialization, HIV/AIDS crises, depth psychology boom. 1995, Sagittarius, globalization, religious fundamentalisms. 2008, Capricorn, financial crises, institutional exposure. 2023 through 2024, network power, AI sovereignty, collective shadow, and projected dissolution of residual structures. Got the Neptune ingress, 1901 through 1902, Cancer, nationalist sentiment, psychoanalytic birth. 1914 through 1916, Leo, war mythology, mass spectacle. 1928 through 1929, Virgo, technocratic idealism, early welfare states. 1942 through 43, Libra, post-war planning, relational ideals. 1955 through 57, Scorpio, nuclear sublime, depth culture. 1970 through 1971, Sagittarius, countercultural expansion, fundamentalism. 1984 through 1985, Capricorn, institutional idealism, late Cold War. 1998 through 1999, Aquarius, digital utopianism, network myths. 2011 through 2012, Pisces, dissolution, bounded crisis, sympathy, politics. And 2025 through 2026, Aries, identity myths, pioneering sacrifice. Uranus and Chiron selected modern, so Uranus and Gemini, 1941 through 49, 1981 through 88, and 2025 through 33. Chiron, Taurus, 1926 through 34, 76 through 84, 26 through 33, 34. Each pair of cycles shows progressive intensification of informational and value-related themes, respectively. Full station lists are reserved for the ephemeral supplement. So here is the midpoint formulae and orb protocols. The basic midpoint formula, where is absolute tropical longitude, eat the complementary arc so that n falls on the shorter path. Orb protocol, midpoint activation by third body or angle, can be less than 1 degree. This is for this monograph. Applying major aspect, conjunction, opposition, square involving Saturn, Mars, Pluto, or Ketu, lesser than 2 degrees. Applying major aspect between two outer planets, lesser than 1 degree 30. And separating aspects are recorded but subordinated to applying one's for event timing. Got key midpoints monitored for 2025 through 2035. Saturn, Neptune equals 9 degrees Aries. Uranus, Pluto equals 4.5 degrees Aries. Chiron, Saturn, 7.5 degrees Aries. Chiron, Neptune, 2 degrees Aries. Neptune, Pluto, 3 through 4 degrees Pisces, Aquarius. Here is a schematic aspect and wheel diagrams. Figure 1, Section 2 presents the generational wheel for August 21st, 2026, with Figure 2 isolates the Saturn-Neptune midpoint. Additional schematic representations of the Uranus-Pluto trine and Chiron threshold may be generated from the same ephemeris data for seminar use. All diagrams employ the tight orb filter. Only aspects and midpoints within the protocols of Appendix B are rendered. So this is the generational sky, Saturn, Neptune, near conjunction, Aries, Pluto, Aquarius, Uranus, Gemini, Chiron, Taurus. And supplements. 1, glossary of technical terms. applying aspect, an aspect whose orb is decreasing given priority for event timing. Generational planet, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and an extended usage Chiron, bodies whose sign placement is shared by multi-year cohorts. Midpoint, the longitude equidistant from 2 planets, treated herein as a primary carrier of archetypal information. Tight orb for the study, lesser than 1 degree for midpoints, lesser than 2 degrees for applying malefic major aspects. Malefic in classical terminology, Saturn and Mars, extended here to include Pluto and Ketu when tightly configured. Ingress the entry of a planet into a new zodiacal sign, and station the apparent cessation of motion before retrograde or direct change a high-intensity temporal node. Supplement 2 is notes on historiographic method. Correlation of planetary cycles with historical events does not imply causation in the mechanistic sense. The method employed here is archetypal and morphological. It seeks isomorphic patterns between celestial configurations and collective human phenomena. Counterexamples and null results are acknowledged. The tight orb filter is itself a response to the problem of overdetermination. Researchers are urged to test protocols against independent data sets and to publish negative findings. Here are the notes. On the epistemological justification for restricted orbs and mundane work, compare the methodological discussions and the historical ephemeris of Paladin Jenkins and the cycle studies of André Barbault. The present protocol is stricter than either. We've been clustering around tight applying outer planet aspects has been documented in multiple independent studies of these periods. The 1 through 2 degrees window consistently outperforms wider orbs in discriminatory power. Saturn ingress dates are taken from standard tropical ephemerides. Minor discrepancies of hours do not affect sign level analysis. Pluto, Neptune, and Uranus ingress tables synthesize data from all are consistent with the 1 day for the modern period. Chiron ingress dates follow the most recent census. And the concept of triple generational resonance is original to this monograph and awaits further empirical testing. You can see the 1840s through the 1860s and other historical analogs. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one. Piscean out.